Welcome back. I'm Aurangzeb Bhatti, and this is Business Plus Charting the Market. Let's look at some live charts of some banks listed on Karachi Stock Exchange. Specifically, we look at Bank Alfala, Allied Bank, Askari Bank, and Soneri Bank. For each of the banks, we'll examine their charts for key elements such as daily prices and volume, moving averages, 200, 150, and 9 days, resistance and support lines, divergences, and a couple of oscillators such as the stochastic and on-balance volume. We'll also look at some fundamentals of these stocks to determine how well the companies are doing and how far away they are from their fair value in terms of the stock price. We'll look at two charts for each company. We'll look at a long-term and a short-term. In the end, we'll also give you a few points on how to evaluate banking stocks in general. All right, the first stock we'll look at is Bank Alfala. This is as of yesterday, February 7th, 2008. We look at a 2-year trend of this chart. We can see a formation of a consolidation and then a support line forming upwards. So the trend of the stock definitely is upwards. We'll also see a resistance line on this chart right around 65. And you'll see a green line, which is the on-balance volume for the stock. What does on-balance volume mean? This merely means that as the price of the stock is moving up, more and more people are buying it, or rather, the shares are moving into stronger hands from weaker hands. So we have a positive on-balance volume, we have a trend line, and we also have a consolidation, or rather a point of decision on this stock coming from the top at price around 65 down to 50. This stock is in a decision phase, and it'll break either upwards or downwards. One interesting point you should look at is how well the stock is behaving relative to its 200-day, which is a long-term moving average, and 100-day and 50-day, and as well as the 9-day moving average. All the averages are converging at the decision point. A positive thing about this stock is also the volume as the stock prices went up. Remember, if stock prices move up without volume, it's setting itself up what's called a bull trap, or rather a trader's remorse. So it's a good sign when the stock volume is higher and the stock price moves higher. And as well as when the stock prices drop, the volume shrinks. So that's kind of confirming the fact that more people believe in the stock than otherwise. Let's take a 12-month. Again, we see a nice trend line. And we also see a decision point being formed. The on-balance volume is positive. I'm not going to, in this session, talk about these particular oscillators because they may be it would be unfair for the audience not to understand what this oscillator is and then try to just explain the behavior. So in one of the future sessions, we'll talk about what this oscillator is and how you can relate it to the movement of the stock price. As far as the fundamentals of Bank Alfala are concerned, we see they have 650 million shares outstanding. 35% of the shares are float. Float means the number of shares that are trading, actually. It's a very important point because if the number of shares are not too many and you wind up holding the shares, you may have a problem selling them because remember, there has to be a buyer for each seller. So 35% is a decent amount of shares that are floating, and that amounts to about 227 million shares. The average daily volume of the stock is 8.82 million shares, which means it will take 26 days to cover all the trades on this share. At the bottom of Bank Alfala, we have some valuations that are material. Earnings per share. The company has been consistently earning, or rather the company's earnings have been going consistently higher. We see a huge jump in 2005. This is quite abnormal to see this type of jump, but from what I understand, there was some sale of an asset, or rather unusual earnings that the bank had. Price earnings ratio is another factor of measuring the value of the company, or at least its stock price. And we see that in the past 2 years, Bank Alfala's PE has been in the 20 range, but the projected 2007 is 11. So from that standpoint, the fundamentals again confirm the behavior of the stock charts. The company has a book value share of 24.8. So it's trading at about 2.2 times book value, which again falls in the norm because banks of this range generally are trading in 2.5 to 3.0 times book value. One of the very important points to look for when evaluating a stock is its return on equity. This is actually a measure as to what is the company earning for the assets that they own, clearly, the assets which don't have any debt, or your equity. In this case, the company's been earning above 20% equity, which is a fairly decent return. So all things equal, this would be a thumbs up because the stock charts are conforming as well as the fundamentals of the company are conforming. Next, we'll look at Allied Bank. Again, 3 years chart. We see a trend upwards, both in terms of its 200-day and 100-day moving average, as well as we also see on-balance volume, which is the accumulation of stock by smart investors. Another interesting point to note, Allied Bank, is the sharp jump in volume on a day when the price of the shares climbed roughly to 140. So this is a good sign. The price of the stock should move up in high volume to conform. Otherwise, there is a deviation. If the price of the shares is moving up on low volume, it's a signal that either the stock is setting itself up for a fall, which we call a bull trap, or setting itself up for a trader's remorse. ABL's valuation is fairly decent in terms of its earnings per share, fairly decent. You can see the price earnings ratio is fairly decent in the 8-point range, when historically it ranged from 22 to 10. Net asset value, the net book value, is 56. Again, if you compare it to relative stocks in the same range, it falls at about 2.28 times book value. A typical stock in this range, or rather in this size of the banking business, would be trading at about 2.5, so this is slightly lower than this, slightly above average in that respect. It's got a very decent return on equity, and the number of shares outstanding are also fairly decent. I don't have numbers for the shares that are float. Next stock is Askari Bank. Again, same pattern. I'm not surprised. All banking stocks in Pakistan are doing well, and the stock charts actually are the best place to see and to select which ones you want to buy. Askari Bank is maintaining a nice support at about 85, and it has a resistance at 105, and the stock is now in a phase of a decision making at about 100. So we'll find out soon whether it breaks this or not. Look at the volume on this chart. When it made its big move in April, volume was very, very large. Again, we see a huge jump in volume, and then again in October we see a huge jump in volume, and then December 2000, huge jump in volume. So definitely there is interest in this stock by professionals and by funds and stockbrokers, and the stock sort of tells a story that is very positive. If you look at their financials, they're very decent, very high earnings per share relative to others. I don't have the dividend numbers, but price earnings ratio is in norm. Book value per share is again in norm. However, the book value, even though it's in norm, it's trading slightly above the standard book value for this size of bank. But again, since it's got a very exceptional growth and earnings, generally it's okay to overlook a few points difference in book value per share. It has 308 million shares outstanding, and I don't have the float on it. The last bank we look at today is Suneri Bank. Suneri Bank 2-year trading. Again, we'll see trend line forming. Incidentally, this trend line was broken in April, and or rather June of last year, and then again it formed a new base at around 35 rupees a share. So 35 is our new base, and we have a conversion. We have a decision point forming with a trend line, or rather a resistance trend line, coming down to around 40. This stock too is waiting to make a decision, and within a few short days or within a few weeks, we'll see it either break up or downwards from this trading trend. Volume on the stock seems also very decent. Suneri Bank 12-month, same picture. We see, interestingly, a decision point which is so narrow that for the last week to 2 weeks, the stock's been trading 1 rupee up or 1 rupee downwards. This is interesting because very soon it either has to go break upwards or break downwards. Most likely, in our view, or in my view, the stock will break upwards because the fundamentals of the company look very strong. If it does break downwards, I would recommend a buy on it. The company is growing. They offer bonus shares. They have dividends they give out. Number of shares outstanding are decent, very decent return on equity. You can see 21%, almost 22% return on equity. Book value per share is 22, again, normal, 2.0 times book. Price to book ratio is actually below, and trailing 12 months earnings is very decent. Price earnings ratio is below 10, which is a good sign as well. The fundamentals actually are in favor of the stock moving upwards. In the next program, we'll explain what price to book value ratio is, because we talked about it today, but most people, I'm sure, don't know what it means. And also, we'll talk about price to earnings ratio. Particularly in our next session, we'll talk about what price to earnings ratio means in an inflationary environment, how it can be deceptive, just like the book value can be deceptive. Also, we'll look at one of the several chart patterns. Today, we looked at just a very simple movement pattern, or we call it the zigzag movement, upwards or downwards. But believe me, stock charts have a life of their own, and they form many interesting chart patterns. Each pattern has a unique and interesting name, and each pattern has a story to tell. So learn the secret of reading stock charts and learn the story behind charts. Next week, we'll also take a look at charts of cement stocks. This week, we looked at banking stocks. We look at stocks trading on the cement stocks trading on the Karachi Stock Exchange. If you have a specific stock or a company that you want us to look at, please email to Business Plus with your request of the company and the chart, and we'll take a look at it for you. Thanks for being with us. I'm your host, Aurangzeb Bhatti, for Business Plus, charting the market. Until next week, Khuda Hafiz.